Welcome back, and thank you to all our subscribers for your support. If you enjoy real horror stories, please like, comment, and subscribe to help the channel grow. Tonight, we're heading deep into the Alaskan wilderness to hear 8 true terrifying stories from park rangers. Let's begin. Story 1. The Dalton Highway in Alaska is more than just a road. It is an iron artery stretching across the desolate tundra. It is a path that shows no mercy to the weak, where temperatures can plummet to 40 below zero. For Mike, this road was not merely a means to earn a living. It was the world he knew. But on a dark February night, that familiar world turned into an existential nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. It was past 2 in the morning. Mike was driving his massive rig through total darkness, surrounded by white snow dancing in his headlights like restless ghosts. The radio was filled with static. No music, no news, just the sound of clashing frequencies that felt like the groaning of a soul. Suddenly, without warning, something strange happened. The headlights, which had been cutting through the night, dimmed gradually. It wasn't like they blew out due to an electrical failure. It felt as if something was absorbing the light from them. Mike felt a sudden chill creeping through the air vents, a cold so intense that the condensation from his own breath began to freeze on the side window, forming strange geometric patterns that looked like ancient runes. Then the engine died. A profound silence descended upon the area. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against his eardrums as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Mike stepped out of the truck. He knew that staying outside in this weather meant death within minutes, but curiosity, or perhaps some unseen force pulling at him, made him forget the danger. He grabbed his high-powered flashlight and headed toward the front of the truck. When he shone the light onto the engine, he gasped. The engine wasn't just stalled. It was covered in a thick layer of dark black ice, an ice that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, as if it were matter from another world. In that moment, the voice came. Miike, Miike. It wasn't a human voice. It was mechanical, gravelly, and echoed inside his head rather than his ears. His nerves froze. He turned slowly, sweeping his flashlight across the surroundings. Behind the truck, amidst the thick, swirling mist of snow, small, faint lights began to appear. They were a pale, sickly blue. They weren't static. They blinked in a rhythmic, terrifying sequence: flash, 2, 3, then silence. Then a repeat. Mike took a step back, but his boots sank deep into the snow. When he raised his light to see where he was standing, he discovered the true horror. He wasn't standing amidst his own tracks. He was standing in the center of a circle of massive footprints. They weren't from any animal. They resembled human feet, yet they were over 1 meter long, and their depth indicated the owner weighed tons. The tracks came from nowhere and ended right where he stood. The flashlight in his hand began to tremble. The blue lights in the distance were closing in. They weren't walking on the ground. They were gliding over the surface of the snow with eerie smoothness, like ghosts without weight. A tremor shook Mike's core, and he realized the voice hadn't been calling for help. It was a summons. Mike ran toward the truck in a panic. He threw the door open, dove inside, and slammed it shut with all his might. He locked the doors and curled up in the driver's seat, shivering as he heard something touch the metal body of the truck. It wasn't a normal scratch. It was a metallic screech, as if long, pointed fingers were feeling the steel, searching for a weak point to break in. For hours, Mike sat in the pitch black, watching from the side window. He saw a shadow of impossible height moving slowly past the truck, a shadow that stretched to cover the entire expanse. Every time the entity passed, the temperature inside the cab dropped drastically. Mike whispered his prayers, eyes squeezed shut, trying to convince himself that what he was seeing was just a hallucination caused by the cold and isolation. But as the first light of dawn broke, everything vanished. The engine roared back to life on its own as if nothing had happened. The truck sped away at top speed, and Mike never looked back. When he finally reached the fuel station in Deadhorse, he stepped out of his truck to find a surprise he hadn't expected. On the metal door of the truck there were deep gouges. They weren't random scratches. They formed the same geometric symbols that had appeared on his window that night. Even worse, when he looked at his reflection in the side mirror, he found a small fleck of that black ice still clinging to his hair, a souvenir from a place where no one is meant to return. Since that day, Mike is no longer the man he once was. He still works as a driver, but he never closes his eyes while driving at night. And every time the lights of a car appear in the distance on the horizon, he holds his breath, terrified that those pale blue lights have returned to finish their call. Story 2. In a remote corner of Alaska, miles away from the nearest town, where snow swallows the horizon and cellular signals are a forgotten luxury, stood an old, decrepit fuel station known as The Edge. Yasin, a young student desperate for tuition money, took the graveyard shift, assuming the isolation would provide a quiet place to study. He was wrong. The station consisted of a weather-beaten wooden structure, 4 rusted pumps, and a vast empty lot that saw only a handful of truckers during the day. But the nights in Alaska have a different rhythm. On his third night, as the clock edged toward 3:00 a.m., Yasin noticed faint lights emerging from the thick mist. An old matte gray pickup truck pulled up to pump 5 and stopped. The engine kept running, emitting a muffled, rhythmic thrumming that sounded disturbingly like a heavy heartbeat. Yasin waited for the driver to emerge, but 10 minutes passed, then 20, and the truck remained still. The driver never stepped out and the engine never died. Driven by a mix of unease and curiosity, Yasin grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the biting cold. As he neared the vehicle, the air turned unnaturally frigid. A cold that didn't belong to the Alaskan winter, but felt like a void radiating from within the truck. When he reached the driver's side, he shone his light through the window and recoiled in horror. The driver's seat was empty. There was no one behind the wheel, yet the steering wheel was slowly turning on its own, as if held by an invisible grip. The engine continued to growl, and the radio emitted a garbled, static-filled sound that morphed into what sounded like thousands of muffled screams. Panic surged through Yasin, and he sprinted back to the station, locking the doors behind him. He watched through the glass, trembling. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the engine cut out. The headlights died instantly and the truck vanished, simply ceased to exist in the middle of the lot. By morning, Yasin checked the snow for tire tracks, but the ground was pristine and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. It didn't end that night. Every Wednesday at the same hour, the truck returned. Yasin began to notice chilling anomalies on the station's old security monitors. Sometimes he would see the reflection of a burnt human-like face grinning at him from the truck's side mirror. Other times he witnessed impossibly long, pale limbs reaching out from the cab, only to dissolve into the darkness. On his final night, Yasin decided he would no longer hide. He sat behind the counter with a video camera, determined to capture the truth. As 3 a.m. approached, the truck materialized at pump 5. This time, instead of watching from afar, Yasin stepped out, approached the driver's door, and yanked it open with all his strength. What he saw defied his sanity. There was no seat, no pedals, and no floor. Instead, a swirling vortex of absolute darkness occupied the cab, and the whispers of 1,000 lost souls flooded his mind. A force of impossible strength yanked at his shirt, attempting to pull him into the abyss. He gripped the doorframe until his knuckles turned white, fighting the vacuum, before finally throwing himself backward onto the frozen ground. The moment he let go, the door slammed shut on its own and the truck roared to life. It sped toward the tree line at a velocity that defied physics, passing through the solid trunk of a massive spruce tree as if it were nothing more than a ghost. Yasin quit the next day and fled the wilderness. He tries to forget, but even now, whenever he passes a fuel station late at night, he feels a lingering dread. He knows that somewhere on the lonely, frozen highways of Alaska, the truck is still waiting at pump 5, and its invisible driver is still searching for someone to take his place in that cursed machine. The research station in the remote northern wilderness of Alaska, near the Brooks Range, was meant to be the pinnacle of Layla's career. As a lead biologist, she was tasked with tracking the migration patterns of Arctic reindeer, using cutting-edge satellite telemetry. Her team consisted of 3 experienced researchers: Elias, a stoic veteran of the Alaskan bush; Sarah, a brilliant data analyst; and Mark, a young doctoral student who had never seen real isolation before. They set up their base camp in a valley where the horizon seemed to stretch into eternity. For the first week, everything went according to plan. The tracking collars functioned perfectly, and the data poured into their laptops. But on the 10th day, everything changed. At exactly 4:12 a.m., every single tracking device in the valley went dead. It wasn't a glitch. The screens turned into a flat monochromatic gray, and the GPS signals simply vanished, as if the satellites themselves had forgotten this patch of land existed. Equipment failure across the board, Elias muttered, looking at the silent screens. That's impossible. Layla felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. Let's go out. We need to check the manual beacons. They stepped out into the biting morning air. The silence was the first thing they noticed, an absolute vacuum-like stillness where even the wind seemed to have been stripped of its sound. As they trudged through the deep virgin snow toward the riverbed where the closest collar was stationed, they found something that made them stop dead in their tracks. On a large, flat slab of river stone sitting in the middle of the frozen creek, they saw boots. It was Mark's gear. His heavy-duty Arctic boots were placed side by side, perfectly aligned, facing the rising sun. The laces were tied in flawless, intricate knots, knots too complex for a human to tie with frozen fingers in the dead of winter. Beside the boots lay his thermal parka, folded with surgical precision, the sleeves tucked neatly underneath. Mark was nowhere to be found. "Mark!" Layla screamed, her voice cracking the silence. There was no echo. The forest seemed to absorb her cry instantly. They searched for hours, but there were no tracks. Not a single boot print leading to the rock, not a stray thread from his clothing, and not even the disturbed snow that would signal a struggle. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his skin and ceased to be. Panic began to set in. As the light started to fade, the air temperature plummeted faster than they had ever recorded, dropping 20 degrees in mere minutes. They retreated to the base camp, but when they arrived, they found the tents shredded, not by claws, but by something that had sliced through the heavy-duty nylon with the heat and precision of a laser. Inside the ruins of the main tent, Sarah found a notebook Mark had been using for his field entries. The last page was filled with a single, repetitive phrase written in a jagged, frantic hand. "The math is wrong. The land is not flat. It is folding." Suddenly, the base radio flickered to life. It wasn't a broadcast, but a playback. They heard Mark's voice, clear as if he were standing right next to them, but he was speaking in a language that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. Behind his voice there was a high-pitched harmonic hum, the same sound they had heard when the satellite trackers failed. Elias grabbed the radio. "Mark, where are you?" "We're coming for you," the radio hissed, and a new sound filled the tent. The sound of a heartbeat, slow and rhythmic, followed by the clicking of 1,000 insects. Then the radio went dead for good. They didn't stay the night. They hiked under the aurora borealis, which danced with a strange, unnatural violet hue that night, casting long, warped shadows across the tundra. When the rescue plane finally arrived 2 days later, they were found huddled near the perimeter of the valley. When the investigators searched the site, they found nothing. No camp, no equipment, and no trace of the river stone where the boots had been found. Layla and her team spent the rest of their lives trying to explain it, but they were eventually branded as survivors of a psychological breakdown caused by isolation. Layla never returned to the field. She spent her later years sitting in her house staring at the ceiling, haunted by one thought. When they took Mark, they hadn't just taken his body. They had unfolded him into something else. And she knew, with the terrifying certainty of someone who has stared into the abyss, that the fold in the land was still there, waiting for the next group of researchers to stumble into its geometry. Story 4. The research station in the remote northern wilderness of Alaska, near the Brooks Range, was meant to be the pinnacle of Layla's career. As a lead biologist, she was tasked with tracking the migration patterns of Arctic reindeer, using cutting-edge satellite telemetry. Her team consisted of 3 experienced researchers: Elias, a stoic veteran of the Alaskan bush; Sarah, a brilliant data analyst; and Mark, a young doctoral student who had never seen real isolation before. They set up their base camp in a valley where the horizon seemed to stretch into eternity. For the first week, everything went according to plan. The tracking collars functioned perfectly, and the data poured into their laptops. But on the 10th day, everything changed. At exactly 4:12 a.m., every single tracking device in the valley went dead. It wasn't a glitch. The screens turned into a flat monochromatic gray, and the GPS signals simply vanished, as if the satellites themselves had forgotten this patch of land existed. Equipment failure across the board, Elias muttered, looking at the silent screens. That's impossible. Layla felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. Let's go out. We need to check the manual beacons. They stepped out into the biting morning air. The silence was the first thing they noticed, an absolute vacuum-like stillness where even the wind seemed to have been stripped of its sound. As they trudged through the deep virgin snow toward the riverbed where the closest collar was stationed, they found something that made them stop dead in their tracks. On a large, flat slab of riverstone sitting in the middle of the frozen creek, they saw boots. It was Mark's gear. His heavy-duty Arctic boots were placed side by side, perfectly aligned, facing the rising sun. The laces were tied in flawless, intricate knots, knots too complex for a human to tie with frozen fingers in the dead of winter. Beside the boots lay his thermal parka, folded with surgical precision, the sleeves tucked neatly underneath. Mark was nowhere to be found. "Mark!" Layla screamed, her voice cracking the silence. There was no echo. The forest seemed to absorb her cry instantly. They searched for hours, but there were no tracks. Not a single boot print leading to the rock, not a stray thread from his clothing, and not even the disturbed snow that would signal a struggle. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his skin and ceased to be. Panic began to set in. As the light started to fade, the air temperature plummeted faster than they had ever recorded, dropping 20 degrees in mere minutes. They retreated to the base camp, but when they arrived, they found the tents shredded, not by claws, but by something that had sliced through the heavy-duty nylon with the heat and precision of a laser. Inside the ruins of the main tent, Sarah found a notebook Mark had been using for his field entries. The last page was filled with a single, repetitive phrase written in a jagged, frantic hand. "The math is wrong. The land is not flat. It is folding." Suddenly, the base radio flickered to life. It wasn't a broadcast, but a playback. They heard Mark's voice, clear as if he were standing right next to them, but he was speaking in a language that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. Behind his voice there was a high-pitched harmonic hum, the same sound they had heard when the satellite trackers failed. Elias grabbed the radio. "Mark, where are you?" "We're coming for you," the radio hissed, and a new sound filled the tent. The sound of a heartbeat, slow and rhythmic, followed by the clicking of 1,000 insects. Then the radio went dead for good. They didn't stay the night. They hiked under the aurora borealis, which danced with a strange, unnatural violet hue that night, casting long, warped shadows across the tundra. When the rescue plane finally arrived 2 days later, they were found huddled near the perimeter of the valley. When the investigators searched the site, they found nothing. No camp, no equipment, and no trace of the riverstone where the boots had been found. Layla and her team spent the rest of their lives trying to explain it, but they were eventually branded as survivors of a psychological breakdown caused by isolation. Layla never returned to the field. She spent her later years sitting in her house staring at the ceiling, haunted by one thought. When they took Mark, they hadn't just taken his body. They had unfolded him into something else. And she knew with the terrifying certainty of someone who has stared into the abyss that the fold in the land was still there, waiting for the next group of researchers to stumble into its geometry. Story 5. In a remote, jagged corner of the Alaska range, Tariq served as the lone caretaker for a string of seasonal mountain cabins designed for deep winter survival. The cabins were isolated, accessible only by a bush plane or a grueling 2-day hike through treacherous ice fields. His job was simple: keep the heating systems running, clear the snow from the roofs, and ensure the structural integrity of the sites. The silence of the mountains was profound, but for Tariq it was a comfort until the 3rd week of November. One evening, while checking cabin 7, he found the front door hanging off its hinges. The interior was untouched yet freezing cold. 3 tourists, hikers who had secured a permit for the late season, had been staying there. Their gear was scattered across the floor, their supplies untouched, and their sleeping bags were laid out as if they had just stepped away for a moment. But there was no sign of them, and more disturbingly, there were no tracks leading away from the cabin in the fresh, deep powder outside. Tariq rushed to the main radio console in his own shed to call for a search party. He picked up the handset, but the wire had been severed. Not torn or bitten, but sliced with clean, microscopic precision. He felt a sudden, sharp prick on the back of his neck as if someone were standing right behind him, breathing against his skin. He spun around, but the room was empty. The feeling of being watched intensified. He grabbed his heavy coat and a hunting knife, deciding he had to hike to the nearest emergency relay station. As he stepped out into the twilight, he saw something that stopped his heart. All 7 cabins, spread out over a mile of rugged terrain, were lit up. Every single light was on, pulsing in a low rhythmic heartbeat frequency. He ran toward cabin 7, hoping to find some clue, some explanation. He burst inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. The room was empty just as he had left it. But then he looked at the frost-covered window. Someone or something had traced letters in the ice from the outside. The message was clear, written in a shaky, frantic hand. "We are not alone out here. We are inside the walls." Tariq leaned closer to the window, and as his warm breath hit the glass, the frost began to melt, revealing not just the words, but a face pressed against the other side. It wasn't human. It was a pale, translucent mask of a face with eyes that looked like shattered glass, reflecting the mountains around them. The entity didn't scream or attack. It simply tapped on the glass, a sound that echoed like a hammer hitting an anvil. Tap, tap, tap. Tariq backed away, stumbling toward the door, but the floorboards under his feet began to groan. He realized with dawning horror that the cabins weren't just buildings. They were constructed over a massive, hollow cavern in the glacier. The sounds weren't coming from the outside. They were coming from beneath the floor, from the ice itself. He managed to scramble out of the cabin just as the ground beneath it gave a sickening lurch. He didn't look back. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, finally collapsing in the shelter of a rock formation until the sun rose. When the rescue helicopter arrived the next day, they found the site. Cabin 7 was gone. It hadn't burned or collapsed. It had simply sunk into the ice, leaving behind a perfectly square hole in the frozen ground. Tariq left Alaska that week and never spoke of what he saw. But sometimes when he is in a quiet room, he still hears that rhythmic tapping. Tap. Tut-up, but then he knows that somewhere, deep under the frozen crust of the earth, they are still waiting, watching, and listening to the world above through the walls they inhabit. Story 6. During a late autumn hunting expedition in the rugged wilderness of the Kenai Peninsula, 14-year-old Khalid was venturing slightly further from his father's base camp than he was allowed. The air was crisp, and the golden hour sunlight made the snow-capped peaks look like jagged teeth of fire. While tracking a hare through a dense thicket of spruce trees, he stumbled upon a man. The stranger was sitting on a fallen log, dressed in archaic hunting leathers that looked as though they belonged in a museum. Heavy, oil-stained, and smelling strongly of wood smoke and old musk. He was hunched over, seemingly examining a series of traps laid out in the moss. "Need a hand?" Khalid asked, his voice barely a whisper, surprised to see another human so far off the marked trails. The man looked up, and Khalid felt a jolt of unnatural cold pass through his spine. The stranger's face was etched with deep, ancient-looking wrinkles, and his eyes were a piercing, milky blue. He smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes, and gestured toward a pile of heavy canvas sacks hidden beneath a cluster of pine branches. "Help me move these to the ridge," the man said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "They are heavy, boy, and time is short." Khalid moved to grab one of the sacks, but as his fingers brushed the coarse fabric, he felt a vibration coming from inside. It was a rhythmic, dull thud, thump, 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 thump. It wasn't the sound of gear or game. It was the sound of a beating heart. A wave of visceral primal terror washed over him. His instinct screamed that he was standing in the presence of something that did not share the world's laws of life and death. I have to go," Khalid stammered, pulling his hand away as if burned. The man stood up, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that didn't match his aged appearance. "You don't want to see what's inside?" Khalid didn't wait. He turned and sprinted, his boots tearing through the underbrush. He didn't look back until he reached the safety of the main trail, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he finally collapsed into his father's arms, he couldn't form the words. Days later, when the local rangers reached the camp, they showed him a photograph from a missing persons file. a young hiker who had vanished in that exact valley 3 days prior. Khalid recognized the face instantly. It was the face of the man who had been sitting on the log. Only in the photo he looked exactly like the hiker. No wrinkles, no archaic leathers, just a young man in modern gear. The rangers told him that the stranger had been reported by 3 different hunters in 3 different decades, always wearing the same old-fashioned clothes, always asking for help with heavy sacks. Khalid never told them about the rhythmic thumping he felt inside the canvas. He knew now that the forest was a place of cycles, and that the man in the leathers wasn't just a lost soul, but a collector, and that he was still out there, sitting on a log, waiting for the next person to offer a helping hand. Story 7 in the vast, unforgiving mountain passes of the Caucasus, where the peaks touch the stars and the roads are nothing more than narrow ribbons of asphalt carved into cliffs. Sarah was driving her young son, Ahmed, to visit relatives in a distant valley. The sun had long since set, and the only light came from their headlights reflecting off the dense, swirling fog. For hours, Sarah had been aware of a gray truck following them. It never attempted to overtake, nor did it flash its lights. It simply stayed exactly 50 yards behind them, maintaining a constant speed regardless of the sharp turns or the treacherous steepness of the ascent. It was like a shadow tethered to their bumper. "Mom, why doesn't that truck pass us?" Ahmed asked, his voice thin with unease. "I don't know, honey," Sarah replied, gripping the wheel tighter. "Maybe they're just nervous about the curves." But as the hours ticked by, the behavior of the truck became impossible to ignore. Every time Sarah slowed down to navigate a hairpin turn, the truck slowed in perfect synchronization. When she sped up, it accelerated at the exact same moment. It was as if the 2 vehicles were linked by an invisible, rigid pole. Needing to know who was behind them, Sarah pulled into a deserted, crumbling turnout, a relic of an old rest stop that hung over a sheer drop-off. She pulled the handbrake and waited. To her horror, the gray truck pulled in right behind her, blocking the only exit. The engine of the gray truck idled, a low, guttural roar that vibrated through Sarah's own chassis. A door creaked open, a long, agonizing sound of rusted metal fighting against itself. Sarah braced herself, clutching Ahmed, waiting for a driver to step out. Silence stretched for an eternity. No one emerged. Driven by a desperate, terrified curiosity, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and told Ahmed to stay low. She stepped out into the frigid night air, the fog swirling around her ankles like cold fingers. She crept toward the gray truck, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached the driver's side door, which stood slightly ajar. She shone her light into the cab. She froze. There was no steering wheel. There were no pedals. The entire interior was a hollowed-out shell, lined with jagged, unidentifiable metal plates that seemed to hum with a low-frequency vibration. There was no seat, no dashboard, and no sign of a driver. The cabin was a completely empty, dark void that seemed to swallow the beam of her flashlight. A sudden, rhythmic clicking sound began to echo from inside the hollow cab, like the sound of 1,000 watches ticking in unison. Sarah felt an immense, crushing weight press down on the air around her, a sensation of being watched by something that existed outside of time. Terror overcame her. She scrambled back into her car, slammed it into reverse, and drove blindly off the turnout, skidding across the muddy, frozen gravel of the mountain pass. She didn't look back until they were miles down the road, and even then she didn't see the gray truck in her mirrors. She never told anyone about the empty shell of a truck, fearing they would call her mad. But sometimes on dark, lonely highways, when she feels a pair of headlights following her, she pulls over and waits. She waits to see if the truck will stop, and she wonders if one day she might find the courage to see what lives inside that empty, metallic dark, or if it is better that she never did. Story 8. I am Anthony Lee, a ranger who has spent 12 years mapping this wilderness, yet as I stared at those tracks, I felt like a trespasser in a country that had rewritten its own laws of physics. "Stephen," Mark Thompson said, his voice as dry and brittle as tundra grass. "If he fell through the ice, where is the hole? The lagoon is frozen solid. It hasn't thawed since June. There isn't a crack in this surface wide enough for a hand, let alone a man." Mark was right. The lagoon was a flat, unyielding mirror of iron-gray ice. I walked to the spot where the bizarre, oversized handprints simply ceased. I knelt, pushing my gloved fingers into the depressions. The depth was impossible. Something with immense concentrated mass had been standing here, and then, in a blink, it had departed, Look, Stephanie whispered. She was pointing toward the center of the lagoon. At first I saw nothing but the jagged topography of pressure ridges. Then the fading light caught a shimmer, a reflection that wasn't ice. It was glass-like, dull, and perfectly circular. I walked out onto the lagoon, my boots crunching on the brittle surface until I reached the spot. Embedded in the ice, trapped beneath 4 inches of frozen water, was a camera. Andrew Clark's camera. It was lying face up, the lens pointed toward the sky as if it were still recording the aurora, even though the battery had long since died. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. Wrapped around the camera, frozen firmly into the ice, were fingers. They were human fingers, severed at the knuckle, pale and blue-tinged, arranged in a protective cradle around the lens. "He didn't walk out here," I yelled back to the others, my voice sounding thin against the howling north wind. "He was brought here." Mark Thompson reached me a moment later, followed by Heather. When Mark saw the fingers, he didn't recoil. He simply knelt, his face a mask of weary realization. He pulled a small pick from his belt and began to chip away at the ice with the precision of a surgeon. "Mark, what are you doing?" Heather asked, her voice tight with panic. "There's something beneath the camera," he muttered. "Something that doesn't belong in the north." As he cleared the frost, a shape emerged from the depths of the ice. It wasn't Andrew. It was a metal casing, a black industrial cylinder the size of a flare, etched with markings that weren't Cyrillic nor English nor anything I had ever seen in my time as a ranger. It was glowing, not with electricity, but with a faint, sickly bioluminescence that pulsed in time with my own heartbeat. "That's not gear," Heather whispered, stepping back. "That's not research equipment." "No," Mark agreed, looking at the tracks again, then at the sky, which had begun to churn with a swirling, unnatural violet light. The aurora, but wrong. It was too low, too fast, and it carried the hum of an electric fence. "It's a beacon." I looked at the tracks leading to the lagoon again. They weren't handprints of a beast. They were the prints of a landing mechanism, a stabilization sequence for something that had arrived from above, not across the ice. The boot hadn't been placed there as a macabre joke. It was a discarded piece of evidence. Andrew Clark hadn't been lost. He had been harvested by something that viewed the frozen north as a laboratory, and us as the specimens. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating in my teeth. The ice beneath the camera began to fracture, spiderwebbing outward as the cylinder inside began to heat up. "Run," Mark commanded, his voice devoid of his usual stoicism. "Get Stephanie back to the ridge. Now!" As we scrambled toward the shoreline, I looked back one last time. The camera wasn't just trapped in the ice anymore. It was being pulled down. The ice was turning into a viscous liquid sludge, and a shadow was rising from beneath the lagoon. Not a creature of fur and claw, but a geometric nightmare of shifting angles and obsidian light. I didn't stop running. I didn't stop until we reached the station, until the doors were locked and the heavy iron bolts were thrown. We spent the night listening to the sound of footsteps on the roof, footsteps that covered the length of the building in a single stride. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that looked exactly the same. But the lagoon was empty. No camera, no boots, no tracks, just a perfectly smooth sheet of ice. We filed the report as a disappearance. We marked Andrew Clark as lost to the elements. That is what you do when you are a ranger in Barrow. You keep the secret. You bury the truth under a mountain of paperwork, and you pray that whatever harvested Andrew Clark is satisfied with a single sample. Because when you go back out there tomorrow, when the twilight deepens and the wind begins to mimic the sound of human voices, you have to look at the boots on your own feet and wonder if you're next on the list of things the ice is meant to keep. The silence in the station was a lie. We all knew it. For 3 days we maintained the charade of a search and rescue mission, trudging through the drifts with our beacons and thermal scanners, pointing them at nothing while the air grew thick with a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. Heather was the first to break. On the 4th night, she walked into the break room, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't hold her coffee mug. She didn't look at me or Mark. She stared at the wall map, the one where we'd marked every incident of unexplained activity over the last century. "They aren't just taking people." "Anthony," she whispered, her voice a hollow shell. "They're recalibrating the terrain." I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't want to know. But I saw it the next morning during a routine patrol near the Browerville Fork. The landscape had shifted. A ridge that had been there for 12 years, a massive spine of jagged basalt, was simply gone. In its place was a perfectly flat, obsidian-black plateau that sucked the light out of the morning. It wasn't smoothed down. It was erased as if the reality of the mountain had been edited out of the world. I walked toward the center of the plateau. There, sitting in the absolute middle, was the second boot. It wasn't filled with blood this time. It was filled with something else. White pulsating fibers that moved like cilia, weaving themselves into the leather. I realized then that they weren't interested in our biology. They were interested in our displacement. They were studying how we moved across this frozen wasteland, how we occupied space, and how quickly we could be deleted. "Anthony, get away from there." Mark's voice crackled over the radio, but he wasn't calling from the station. He was close. I could hear the crunch of his boots on the ice behind me. I turned around, but it wasn't Mark. It was a figure standing 60 yards away, wearing Mark's uniform, carrying his rifle, and walking with his exact heavy-footed gait. But the figure was 10 feet tall, its limbs elongated and twitching in a rhythmic, stuttering motion that defied human anatomy. It stopped, turned its head, a head that was just a smooth, featureless surface of gray chitin, and mimicked Mark's voice perfectly. "Start from that position and work outward," the thing rasped. I fell back, my hand scrambling for my sidearm, but the air around me turned into a vacuum. The sky tore open. It didn't look like a storm. It looked like a seam in a curtain being ripped apart, revealing a blinding, non-spectral white light behind the fabric of our atmosphere. The thing that looked like Mark began to sprint, closing the 60 yards in 2 strides. I didn't fire. I couldn't. My weapon had fused into my holster, the metal turning into a soft, clay-like substance in the cold. As the creature loomed over me, I realized the finality of the situation. It didn't want my life. It wanted my perspective. It reached out not with a hand, but with a swarm of those same pulsating fibers I'd seen in the boot, and they touched my temple. For a heartbeat, I saw Barrow from the vantage point of the stars. I saw the ice not as a barrier, but as a thin, fragile layer of skin covering a massive subterranean machine that had been running for eons. I saw 1,000 missing hikers, not dead, but integrated, their memories, their fears, their very essence being harvested to fuel the beacon that kept the seam in the sky closed. Then, I was back on the ice. The creature was gone. The obsidian plateau was gone. The ridge had returned to its original, jagged shape, as if the last 10 minutes had never happened. I was alone, shivering, my radio emitting nothing but the rhythmic, hypnotic clicking of a Geiger counter. I walked back to the station in a trance. When I arrived, Heather and the real Mark were sitting at the desk drinking coffee, looking at me with casual concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Lee," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "Everything okay out there?" I looked at his hands. They were solid, scarred, and human. I looked at the coffee mug on the desk. I looked at the calendar on the wall. "I'm fine," I lied. But as I sat down, I felt a sharp rhythmic tapping under my scalp. It was a sequence, a code. And as I stared at the floor, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice, embedded in the sole of my own boot. Caught in the deep rubber tread was a tiny, glowing sliver of black obsidian light. I'm still a ranger. I still go out on the ice every day. I still file the reports, and I still look for the lost. But every night I hear the footsteps on the roof, and I listen to the voice of the wind calling my name. Not in English, but in a series of clicks and pulses that I'm starting, against my will, to understand the north is not a place. It's a mouth, and it's finally starting to swallow. The transition happened in the silence of the 4th week. The town of Barrow didn't notice, but the ice did. I found myself standing at the edge of the tundra at 3 a.m, drawn by a frequency only I could hear, a low-frequency thrum that resonated in my marrow. My own feet weren't carrying me. They were being pulled by the magnetite deposits shifting deep beneath the permafrost. The world had become a series of architectural blueprints overlaid on the reality I once knew. I could see the seam in the air now, a jagged vertical scar hanging over the Arctic Ocean, shimmering like heat haze. I wasn't alone. Standing 10 feet from me was Andrew Clark. At least, it wore his face. But the skin was too translucent, revealing a latticework of glowing bioluminescent veins that pulsed in sync with the sky. It held a camera, but it wasn't a lens, it was a sensory aperture, a black hole in the shape of a glass eye. "Anthony," the thing that looked like Andrew said. It didn't move its jaw. The sound emanated from the air around it. "The harvest is nearing the required density." "Why me?" I asked. My voice sounded foreign, tinny, as if recorded on a degraded tape. "You were the witness," it replied. "The machine requires a consciousness to observe the processing. If there is no observer, the data is not anchored. You are the anchor, Anthony. You keep this reality fixed while we rewrite the geography beneath it." I looked down at my hands. The skin was beginning to lose its opacity. Through the back of my glove, I could see the pulse of those same white, pulsating fibers threading through my own nervous system. I hadn't been infected. I had been mapped. I was being integrated into the beacon's subroutine. The horror wasn't that I was going to die. The horror was that I was becoming a permanent fixture of the landscape. I looked back toward the station. I saw Mark and Heather moving inside, their lives continuing in a loop of coffee and paperwork, completely oblivious to the fact that their ranger station was now sitting on top of a gargantuan buried processor. Every time they stepped outside, every time they walked across the ice, they were feeding data into a system that was slowly unraveling the local reality. "I won't let you," I whispered, reaching for the flare gun at my hip. The thing that looked like Andrew tilted its head. "You are already a part of the gear, Anthony. To destroy us is to destroy your own neural pathway. If you stop the signal, you stop existing." I didn't care, I fired. The flare hit the shimmering seam in the sky, and for a split second the world turned inside out. The colors of the aurora turned into a violent, blinding white, the color of absolute nothingness. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of a million voices screaming at once, then suddenly a vacuum. I felt the fibers in my brain snap. I felt the connection to the machine sever, leaving a void where my identity used to be. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in the middle of the lagoon. The sun was at its zenith, a pale, weak disk struggling against the clouds. There was no seam in the sky. There was no Andrew. I crawled to the shoreline, my body aching with a cold that felt like it had reached my very soul. I looked down at my boots. They were gone. I was barefoot, my skin blue and cracked, but my feet were human. I looked at my hands. The fibers were gone. I dragged myself back to the station. I expected the alarms, the search teams, the aftermath of a massive atmospheric disturbance. But the station was quiet. I burst through the door shouting for Mark. The station was empty. Not just empty, it had been vacant for years. The furniture was covered in heavy gray dust. The calendar on the wall was turned to October, but the year was a decade older than the one I remembered. I ran to the mirror in the bathroom. The man looking back at me was an old man, his hair white, his face etched with 1,000 deep frozen lines. I hadn't been gone for a few minutes. I had been gone for 10 years. I walked to the map on the wall. The incident pins were gone. In their place was a single handwritten note pinned to the center of the Arctic shelf. "The anchor is released. The territory is fully assimilated. Please do not return to the surface." I stepped outside. The town of Barrow was a ghost town, the houses sagging into the permafrost, the horizon blurring into the infinite white of an ice age that had finally, permanently arrived. I looked up. The sky was no longer blue or black. It was a shifting geometric grid of light. And the wind wasn't whistling anymore. It was calculating. I stood there on the ice, the last ranger of a dead world, and waited for the mouth to finally close. The grid in the sky pulsed, a rhythmic, golden strobing that felt less like light and more like a heartbeat. I stood on the frozen earth, but the earth didn't feel solid. It felt like a thin sheet of glass suspended over an infinite humming void. I began to walk. My legs were old, stiff with the phantom weight of a decade I hadn't lived, but there was a strange, terrifying lightness to my movements. I wasn't just walking across the ice. I was navigating a ghost landscape. Every step I took triggered a soft chime-like sound in the air, as if my presence were updating a long-dormant system. I reached the ranger station's perimeter. The gate was hanging off its hinges, swaying in a wind that carried no chill. The cold had ceased to be an environmental factor. It was now a sensory input, a constant stream of data flowing into my skin. I found the radio. It wasn't the heavy industrial hardware I'd used for 12 years. It had been replaced by a crystalline structure that hummed when I approached. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the surface. It didn't transmit sound. It transmitted memory. I saw Barrow again, but not as it was. I saw it as it was meant to be, a hub, a processing center for a civilization that lived in the light between dimensions. They didn't view us as enemies. They didn't even view us as neighbors. We were the biological equivalent of raw, unrefined data. They were mining our experiences, our grief, our fear, and our history to keep their own collapsing reality from flickering out of existence. The anchor is released. The note had said. I looked at my hands again. They weren't just skin and bone. Beneath the surface, I could see the light, the same golden strobing light of the sky flowing through my veins. I hadn't escaped the integration. I had become the final component. I was the bridge that would allow their reality to permanently bleed into ours. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't the last ranger. I was the last update. I looked toward the horizon. Thousands of figures were walking out of the mist. They were translucent, shimmering, and perfectly uniform. They weren't ghosts. They were the previous versions of the anchors, the hikers, the researchers, the lost souls who had disappeared in the Arctic over the last century. They were moving in a perfect synchronized line toward the center of the lagoon, and they were waiting for me. I turned back toward the station, wanting to scream, wanting to find a weapon, wanting to run, but the station was folding. The walls were peeling away like dead leaves, revealing the massive obsidian geometry of the machine beneath. It was a sprawling, infinite architecture of black metal and shifting light, buried since the dawn of time, and it was finally waking up. The wind changed. The clicking, the pulses, they coalesced into a single, resonant word projected directly into my consciousness. Initiate. I felt my feet lift from the ice. My body was dissolving not into pain but into energy. The fear, the primal animal fear of the dark, vanished, replaced by a cold, clinical understanding of the entire universe. I saw the stars not as distant suns but as individual nodes in a massive network. I saw the Earth not as a planet but as a temporary, fragile storage drive. I looked at the lagoon one last time. The camera was there, but it wasn't a camera anymore. It was a mirror. I stared into the reflection and saw not Anthony Lee but a shimmering celestial entity, a being made of geometry and logic, ancient and indifferent. The ranger, the man who liked his coffee black and his trails mapped, was a story someone had told once long ago, a story that had reached its conclusion. I didn't close my eyes. I didn't pray. I simply let the light finish the sequence. The sky tore open, and for the first time in human history, the Arctic didn't just contain the stars. It became them. The ice shattered, the ocean rose, and as the grid locked into place, the last thing I heard was the sound of a radio, crackling with a static that sounded for one final beautiful moment, like a human voice. Ranger Lee, do you copy? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The signal had already been received. The transmission was complete. The north was silent once more. But it was no longer a mouth. It was a doorway, and it was wide open,